Welcome Internet to Psychologist Casual Review, and today we're going to be reviewing The Shadow of the Object, Psychoanalysis of the Unthought Known by Christopher Bollas. So this book is a treasure trove of interesting concepts, ideas, and I really feel that it's really worth the read because there are many things he's going to talk about, but his main principal idea is that we build ourselves, our mental representations, who we are, based on early childhood experiences, even infancy. And his main principal idea is that fundamentally, inside of ourselves, there is, of course, ourself, how we perceive ourselves, who we are, but there's also an integration of how the parents perceive us. So in a way, we both have ourselves and another self that's the perception of the parent. In a way, we are both inside of ourselves, self and object. And I found that very interesting because we often see things like the relationship is the object and ourselves is who we are. And here he's saying that they're both together, that we have two sides of who we are. Who we are inside of ourself and our object self. So that's very interesting. He also has an interesting concept I've already talked about, but I'm still going to rehash here, as I still find it very interesting. His concept of transformational object, i.e., for him, what happens is that when a parent takes care of the child, they transform the child's environment, both psychically but also physically, by carrying them around, by changing the world around them. And when the parent and child have a good relationship, that transformative element creates the basis of an adaptability in the child. The child is going to be able to change, to grow, to become different. And the opposite of this phenomena is what he calls the conservative object, i.e. when a child wasn't able to integrate the parent, or the parent-childhood relationship did not go well, what happens is that the child, through the concept of moods, i.e. the feelings, is going to try and maintain the conservative object and not change. He's going to try very deeply not to change, to be able to preserve what he feels is the object, i.e. the relationship. He's going to preserve the relationship whatever the cost, in a way. Even if it's unchangedness or deadness, it's a way of preserving one's internal object. It's quite close to Freud's concept of the shadow of the object. Something has fallen onto the ego and prevents the ego from changing or modifying itself. That's fundamentally what is happening here with the conservative object. It prevents the ego from going further because the ego is too busy trying to preserve the relationship, whatever the cost. And of course, psychoanalysis here is like a second chance because it allows the patient to expand that relationship through moods, through the ambience of the clinical session. And this is pointed out by Bollas very well in the book, that it's a whole gestalt, a whole world, should I say, of perception, of relationships, since that in a way are known because they're through the mood, but are unthought, meaning that they haven't been mentalized, they haven't been brought into consciousness, but they are known because the emotional experience is there with the analyst. And the analyst here becomes, he himself, a revival of the caregivers in a very deep and profound way, and a way that he's not always conscious of. And in this book, he also implies and explains that it's very important to still continue your self-analysis, as this is where you discover who you truly are for the patient and who the patient truly is for you in this deep sense. And he also has very interesting ideas. He talks about the normative people, which is a very interesting concept, very close to what we call in French normopathe. It's people who are so normal that they seem completely devoid of an internal life. But everything is normal. They watch the movies everyone watches, they dress well, they have good jobs, they are creative, but not too much. Everything is completely linear and normal, but yet it's a state of false self, as the individual isn't connected with who they truly are, but they present something that's so normal, so just standardized, that when Bollas was exchanging with a teenager who had a form of normatic illness, he himself was talking about how teenagehood, Bollas was talking about how teenagehood could be expansive, could be explosive, but the teenager, he did not grasp onto that. He virtually refused that because he was in this allure of normalcy. And I found that to be very interesting, as it's a concept that is often very rare, but is incredibly interesting, that too normal is also pathological, that there is something monstrous in the idea of everything being normal, that we still need a grain of madness for it to be acceptable. Then true normalcy is unacceptable. And I found that very interesting, because often it's not the perspective on normal. Normal is what we should reach, and yet here it's conceptualized as something that's deeply pathological. And we can see why. If you're too normal, then there's no space for a true self to emerge. There's no space for spontaneousness. There's no space for who one truly is, because you always have to conform in a way. So he also has this very, very interesting idea of the trisexual, which I found very interesting because also something very special. For him, the trisexual is an individual who fascinates others, who has a wonderful relationship with others, and who spends a time that's completely good with others. And when he separates, there's never any anger, never any hatred. It's just like the time was good, we enjoyed it, now it's time to say goodbye. And he says that in a way, and it's very, very interesting, that they're a form of narcissists that have achieved what all narcissists seeks to achieve, i.e. good relationship with others, while maintaining a form of grandiosity, without themselves feeling belittled, humiliated, and they're not into that. What they're into is making the other person feel as special as they are, but without any form of resentment and belittlement. So I found that to be so very interesting, because we never talk about these successful narcissists, right? And here I'm using that. He talks about narcissism and trisexualness, but he doesn't really expand on it too much. I am expanding here because I found it so very interesting. Because here we have this idea that some form of narcissism can be positive. And again, that's a very interesting claim to make, and one that's not very, how can I say, cultural syntonic, if I may say so. And I found that to be very, very interesting, very enriching. And for Bollas, one of the main works that concepts in psychopathology that he puts forward, and that I found even more interesting, was this idea of introjective extraction, i.e. that it's the opposite of projective identification, right? Projective identification is putting something of yourself into the other and changing the other. But extractive identification is this interesting idea that someone is stealing something from within you, abilities, capacities, be it cognitive, mental, or psychic, that there's someone taking out something out of you. And this is very interesting, as sometimes you work with patients and you lose your words, something has gone missing. And I think that when he talked about that resonated in me as a clinician, as sometimes people, for not necessarily malignant reasons, but because they're lost, or because they can't necessarily process their own minds, tend to put you in a sense of loss as well. And I always conceive that as a form of shared emotion, But his idea of extractive identification is very good. And I also think that can explain a lot of processes. Like, for example, when the other starts doing something that you do and you stop doing it, like you can no longer achieve it because they've taken that out of you psychically and put them in their minds. In a way, they've stolen your ability to do so, and because of that stealiness, you're in a state of shock and you can't use it anymore. So I found that to be an incredible idea, and I really felt that clinically it resonated a lot. It's very hard to explain because it's not easy, nor for the clinician, nor for, I feel, the writer that Bollas is, but I found that the idea is, there's some ring of truth to it that's very deep, and I found that very, very interesting. And I'll one day, I think, make a whole video on this concept. That's how interesting I felt it was. And Bollas also postulates the fact that there is regression is needed. However, we collectively, the therapeutic world, tend to distance ourselves from regression within the patient, or feel that there's something that has gone wrong, because often when we collectively think of regression, we think of extreme cases where the person can't feed themselves, has to go to hospital, has to have someone that's there 24/7 with them. And he says that although those regressions aren't wrong, that it can happen, they're not the mainstay of regression. Regression can be very subtle, very fine, and he points out in the book how it can be by presenting a patient for whom it was going on a boat and regressing to a state where he could connect with the image of his father, because his father loved going on boats. So fundamentally, and this for Bollas was a regression, was a moment for the patient which was an epiphany. And he says that those are more of the regressions we see in clinical practice than the massive ones. And I can't help but feel that this is incredibly true, that sometimes we regress, but the regression is not deep, profound, breaks everything. It's more like sometimes you reconnect with something of yourself, a past self, or even a past object that you've lost. In a way, it's something that you've always known but remained unthought. And I'm making this parallel because Bollas presents this idea over and over, like this is the thread of his whole book. In a way, we know so much through our emotions, through the dynamics we create, through the projections we have, yet they always remain unthought. And Bollas creates a beautiful connection of this theory with Bayon's work, with the alpha function that helps the beta element. So if you don't know, because Bayon is not necessarily mainstream either, the alpha element is the psyche of the mother when she takes care of the infant, which is going to translate what the infant experiences, because the infant can't understand what's happening to him. He needs an external force to, of course, feed him, help him, but also to explain it to him, what is happening, to be able to put a frame on his experience. And for Bollas, that's exactly what psychoanalysis is. We're verbalizing, we're putting a frame on experience that often could not be there because sometimes parents were absent or were unable to take care of their children, creating a lack of a frame, a lack of thinking in the world of the patient, a lack of representation. And that lack of representation is going to affect the patient deeply in a very profound way, which is something that can sometimes only be healed through psychoanalysis, through regression, through the fact of replaying those dynamics, but ever so slightly changing them, through the act, as I was saying earlier, of becoming a transformative object, that the clinician becomes transformative for the patient. But I will also argue that the patient is transformative for the clinician. It works both ways, that being in a relationship is changing and accepted to be changed. And that, I think, Bollas explains perfectly well, that we have to be open to this dynamic, that being on our guards, on countertransference, or seeing it as pathological on our sides, and just explaining the transference for the patient is missing something. And I completely agree with that perspective, that half of the work is the work on our countertransference of what do we feel with the patient. How can our emotions, our shared experience with the patient can help us, guide us in the therapeutic relationship. But, and I have to say this, it's not about like telling them brutally what you feel, like, oh, I'm bored, or oh, I'm this, or I'm that. That's not it. It's like trying to understand what is happening for the patient, like, oh, I perhaps feel lost as he felt lost as a child. And then once you understand that emotionally, you can, and you've thought about it, and the syncing is important, you can then sync it with the patient, meaning that what is known becomes syncable, becomes there, you become aware of it, and the patient becomes aware of it, and you both become aware of it. So for Bollas, that's the main goal of psychoanalysis. And for him, and he also ends with this point, which is a very interesting point, is that silence is not always a defense. Silence sometimes is the patient internalizing everything that has happened and being able to cope on their own, being able sometimes to fantasize or to create something. And that creation can only be there if the clinician keeps silent as well. That in a way is creating this form of space which the patient is playing with in his mind, is conceiving, elaborating, creating, and that in these moments it's very important for the clinician not to interpret, not to intervene, and to see it as something that's generative, i.e. something is being created. And what is being created is this world of the mind, this inner world, or it's been developed or amplified or solidified. And all of that is possible because the patient is introspecting deeply and having an experience with himself in the presence of the analyst. So fundamentally, this book was a treasure trove of ideas. It's a wonderful book, and I would highly recommend if you're not afraid of the vocabulary, because there's a lot of like specific vocabulary to psychoanalysis, but it's so interesting that I would highly recommend the reading of it, as this book has many concepts like trisexual, the conservative object, the transformational object, the self as an object, and all of these things I feel gain through expansion. If we talk about them, I think they can really help our thoughts and our thinking to develop. And that book really helped my clinical thinking to increase. So it's a very stellar recommendation. So I hope you like this review, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.